All right. Hey, I'm Steve Deur, pastor of Watermark Church in Grand Haven, Michigan, and I'm here with a good friend and a guy who's impacted my life deeply. His name is Paul Maconochie. Hi, Paul.
Hi, good to be with you. Good to see you, Steve.
Well, today what I wanted to do is there's been a lot of conversation around me and the different networks I'm a part of, Paul, of folks who say they're really wanting to learn how to multiply disciples, that multiply disciples.
Yep.
And there's a lot of, there's increasing resources for that. But one of the things I've just been real appreciative of is that this is not just something that you think about and talk to other people about. This is something that you yourself have experienced and are experiencing. So I think we have a lot to learn and glean from you. So I appreciate you taking time for us today. So could you just give us a little bit about who you are, your life, your family a little bit, and then kind of your journey in multiplying disciples?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's good to have this time with you, and it's been a joy going on the journey with you, Steve. I mean, we've had an interesting journey over the last few years, haven't we? As we're trying to really work this stuff out together with some other churches too. So for folks who don't know me, my name is Paul Maconochie. Obviously, you can tell from my accent, I'm not from around the Midwest. I'm originally
from around these parts.
No, I'm from England, originally from a city called Sheffield in northern England. I now live in Fort Wayne in northern Indiana, and I'm based out of a church here called Grace Gathering. The journey for me started back in my 20s when I was at a church in the UK, which was unusually an Anglican and Baptist church. So it was in the UK, because there's been so much church decline. One of the positive sides of that is that denominationalism has really gone down. And so you get these different denominations, if they're kind of on the same page in terms of their mission, they'll sometimes team up with each other. So I was in one of those churches. And we got this new pastor who came in, a guy called Mike Breen. And really from the get-go, back in 94, 95, he started teaching us from when he first came in, just these ideas that that we weren't supposed to just be doing church in a way that meant, we did our Bible studies, we had church on Sunday, and we tried to make it good so that more people would come. But that we were actually supposed to learn how to be missionaries, and that we weren't called just to be believers, but we were called to be disciples. And so he started kind of challenging us on that stuff. And that was, I met my wife at that church around that time. And so really from the get-go, as we got married in 96, from that time onwards, we really committed ourselves to this journey of mission and discipleship. And we've orientated our lives that way pretty much ever since. And I think that, the UK is ahead of the curve, unfortunately, the church decline curve from the States, particularly ahead of the Midwest. I don't think the same is quite as true if you're, say, on the West Coast or the East Coast. But certainly we've, church attendance on a Sunday in the 1950s in the UK was around 50%, and now it's around 5%. So, wow. There's been a huge decline of church attendance. In northern England, in Sheffield, which is a kind of post-industrial northern city. I mean, think Pittsburgh, it's that kind of city. It's down to 2.5% on a Sunday. So wow. Hardly anybody goes to church. And so really we were beginning to, what that's done is that started a debate 20 years ago in the UK, which I think I'm hearing now just starting in the US in the last maybe 5 years. And that's that whole thing about we have to learn how to be missionaries. We have to learn how to make disciples. It's not enough just to do church. Have great teaching. Worship music that people will enjoy, and maybe even lovely donuts after the service, and hope that that's going to do it. And we so probably back in the 90s that was no longer cutting it in the UK. So we had to start thinking about other things, and we've really. Just gone back to, I think it's been about going back to core practice of what did it look like what did Jesus do with the 12, with the 72? What did they do going forward as you look into the book of Acts? Really coming back to core biblical principles about what is the Christian life supposed to look like. And I think, there are some folks who've done some great work around the thinking around that. I think about people like recently, people like Alan Hirsch and folks like that who've really dug into the challenge that, the current situation offers the church. Going back a little bit further, people like Dallas Willard really raising up these issues. But what we hadn't found, we found a lot of people who have been really being able to articulate the problem, but we hadn't found many people who'd come up with practical kind of solutions. What do you actually do?
Right. And that was true of us. I mean, for us, we had this, we started our church 15 years ago with a passion to be a missional church, to be the church and make disciples. And there's all this incredible resource. But I felt like we were just throwing stuff against the wall and hoping something sticks. Yeah. So very few things worked. And we didn't pattern it really after Jesus. We just tried a bunch of stuff. Sure. So I like what you're saying. What you're saying is you guys intentionally went back to Scripture to look to what Jesus did for discipleship. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there are a number of things that we noticed. But one of them was that we noticed that our model of what discipleship is was somewhat lacking. So what we understood discipleship to be was that you basically did Bible study and taught each other the Word of God, and maybe if you're going further than that, if you're really kind of a hardcore Christian, you might even have some close friends or accountability partner or something like that, where you'd actually be a bit more accountable about, am I trying to live this stuff out? But we weren't really seeing we didn't have any idea at that point of the idea of actually becoming disciples as a lifestyle. And I think that as we were reading the life of Jesus, and then as you go on the life of Paul, because obviously you have a lot of detail as well about Paul and what he did on his missionary journeys, it felt as if we realized that there seemed to be three components to discipleship. The first is information. You need to be taught some stuff. That's like Jesus teaching the crowds, when he was, feeding the 5,000, Sermon on the Mount, all that kind of stuff. But the second component was imitation, which was that as he taught the crowds, he seemed to be looking for the few who were prepared to really kind of follow him. And you see him recruiting the 12, and then clearly by Luke 10, they've recruited some more because there's 72 by that time. When the disciples first said, what are you doing, Rabbi? He said, come and see. And so what we noticed was that although you need information, and that's important, and we have information in the Bible, for example, there was this imitation phase of discipleship, which seemed to be missing. And then eventually, Jesus, you had the ascension, you had the Great Commission, the disciples went off, and it's their turn to go and do the things that Jesus had taught them. And that's like an innovation phase. So there's definitely a time where you've learned what you've got to learn. Now you've got to put it into practice, go and do it. But it felt like our observation was that discipleship in the West seems to be information straight to innovation with no imitation.
So you go to the next conference, you get the book, go back and try it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, that sounds cool. Let's have a go. And
right.
And so we realized that there's something in this about lifestyle. And as we were thinking about Jesus, we thought about it wasn't just about his word, the words of Jesus. It was about his ways and his works as well. There was a lifestyle, and there was things he actually did. And maybe being disciples means we're supposed to imitate those things. So we started really going after that stuff. And what we noticed was, for example, that in our Western cultural context, everything was focused around the individual, and in terms of family, around the nuclear family. And that just didn't seem to be how Jesus functioned at all. So that was, and then we started reading some of the sociology of the early church. We found some people like, for example, Rodney Stark very helpful in this, and as far as social historians can tell, that massive growth spurt of the early church in the first, up until the Edict of Milan, the kind of growth of the church until it had taken over the Roman Empire, was primarily through the extended family, the oikos in the Greek, rather than our kind of Western nuclear family. And so we started thinking, okay, what we probably need to do is we probably need to find ways to move beyond just doing Bible studies on a Wednesday night church services that are designed to attract Christians on a Sunday, or maybe if you're particularly enlightened and kind of, I don't know, more seeker sensitive, trying to attract folks who aren't yet Christians as well. And then kind of home life focused around the nuclear family. What we began to experiment with is what we now call missional communities, which is let's try and actually go beyond just using programs to meet together occasionally. Let's work out what it really means to be brothers and sisters in Christ, and learn how to have some element of shared life within it, with a more extended family that goes beyond the nuclear family, and where we actually have a shared sense of mission. And by mission, we didn't just mean service projects. We meant actually we could tell you these early missional communities that we developed. They'd be able to say, yeah, we're trying to reach these people with the good news of Jesus. So there was a kind of an evangelistic edge to the mission. It wasn't just social justice, although all Christian communities should be doing acts of service as well. But we're not saying you wouldn't do that. But what we were saying was it's not a substitute for actually sharing the good news of Jesus as well as just loving people, who are the last and the least. So we really started to build out these things. My wife and I were worship leaders at the church, and so we decided that we met on a Thursday night. We were in a small group, a home group that did Bible study on a Wednesday, and then we met to practice up with our worship team on a Thursday. And we decided we were going to turn our worship team into a missional community with this newfangled thing that the pastor was teaching about. So we met with them all. There were about 30 people in the worship team, some very accomplished musicians. It was quite a large church we were in, probably, 600 or 700 at that time, which is big for the UK. And we had a very accomplished worship team with about 30 people in it. And they didn't all play at once, but, we had
wall of
different
sound
groups that could do different things. Yeah.
Big band.
And we basically gave them that vision. We said, okay, guys, we're going to still meet on a Thursday. We're going to eat together. We're going to, think about God's word together. We're going to pray together, and we're going to have a vision for reaching people who don't yet know Jesus. And our vision is just going to be really low bar. It's going to be welcome the stranger. So we're actually going to look on a Sunday in the sanctuary for anyone who's new. Yes, we have a welcome team and all that, but it's difficult for them to get around everybody. We're going to be really super friendly, really welcome them, and we're going to invite them to come and join us on a Thursday night too. Particularly if we feel like they don't know the Lord. It's not always easy to tell, but if we discern that was the case. And so we shared this amazing vision with the worship team. We're very excited about it. They all went away to have a think about it. And a week later, of the 30, 27 left. So there were then 3 of us.
So you did a lot of acoustic mornings after that.
Yeah, we did. Yeah. I mean, I played guitar. My wife played keyboards. So that was okay. The other person who stayed with us played the oboe. So that was kind of tricky.
That was bad. They weren't even really that needed.
No. Well, we had a lot of oboe solos, put it like that, Steve. That's a while. But we went back to the pastor and we said, Mike, we feel like we've bust your worship team. We're really sorry. And he was great. He said, no, you haven't. He said, I'm teaching this stuff to the whole church, and most people are not up for doing it. And I knew that would be the case. I'm looking for the few who are prepared to really go after this. And if you're prepared to do that, he said, I don't care if you just have unplugged worship for a while. It's fine. Let me invest in you guys. Let me mentor you and train you a bit, and let's see where this thing goes. So we just started doing this. And we started with just a few, and we ate together. And then over the next few months, we really began to grow, and we saw quite a few folks coming who didn't know the Lord. In fact, we got catapulted into a completely different kind of ministry. We had this nice kind of middle-class, educated worship team is what we'd signed up for. And one of the guys who got invited was from a drug rehab center in the city, and he became a Christian. He came to faith, turned out to be an evangelist. The next week, he brought 6 of his heroin addict pals with him. Wow. And so we were suddenly catapulted into this missional community where we had prostitutes and drug addicts coming every week. And it was crazy. And over the next 18 months, we saw about 45 people come to faith in that little community.
Wow.
And we grew, and we had to multiply it, and we had to learn, the pastor mentored us in how to do this. We had to raise up more leaders, and we multiplied it. So we ended up with 3 missional communities. And that was our introduction, and there was a turning point for me, which was it was on the Thursday evening. at the time where we used to just put the music stands away. And it wasn't that we didn't still practice for the Sundays, of course we did, but we did it in a much kind of cut down version. We didn't do like the 3-hour special that we used to do. Probably the quality of the music went down, but I think the quality of the worship went up. I think the Lord blessed it. But I was there at kind of, I don't know, 9:45 or something, just at the very, very end. And it was when I used to put the music stands away, and instead I was sitting in the corner of the church lounge where we held our missional community, and I was leading this heroin addict to the Lord. And suddenly it struck me, and I thought, gosh, this feels like authentic Christianity to me. And that was the point at which I got the bug. And you know, I was what, 26 then. I'm much older now, nearly 50 now, and I've never gone back from that time. You know, and nor's my wife and my girls, my family. We've got 2 daughters, and from that time, we've always, from that time on, sought to find people who have a like mind, to do life together with them, other Christians, as an extended family, including food and shared life, and reaching out to the last, the least, and the lost. And as we multiplied that culture, I became the senior pastor of that church after Mike left, so in 2004. And as we grew that culture out and more folks in our church did that, we saw a real kind of breakthrough. I mean, we saw, by the time we left in 2014, we had 100 of those missional communities across the city, with probably, it was about 2,800 people who are regular members of those communities. And we saw, for probably from about 2007 onwards, we saw between 250 and 300 people come to faith a year, every year through that time. Wow. So it was an amazing time of breakthrough and growth. So we've always done that kind of missional community type life ever since, really.
Wow. And you've been helping me, kind of coaching and discipling me on missional community life. And one of the things that was really helpful, before I ask you the next question, is I think you helped kind of phrase something for us. The idea, I think so often when we think of a mission for an extended family on mission, we think of, like you said, a service project. We can go rake this old lady's lawn, which is great. And like you said, that should be the heart of every Christian, meeting the needs in the community. But I think it was like that your mission, your outward momentum, should not be a what, but a who. Who is it that you're seeking to reach through your efforts? Yeah. And I think that's been really helpful.
Yeah. So an example of that would be in our missional community, Ellie and I are now in Fort Wayne, Indiana. We have a missional community, and our missional community, the outreach is to our neighborhood. So we're trying to reach other folks in the neighborhood that we're in. We actually moved into that neighborhood for that reason. There was a couple that invited us to move next door to them and form an extended family group, a missional community with them, to reach out to our neighbors. So we've been doing that for the last couple of years. But as a missional community, those are the people. The who is our neighbors. But actually, we still go every 5 or 6 weeks. We go to a local center for vets who have substance addiction, and basically they have a 2-year residential period of time in that it's called the Shepherd's House, and get free. And so that's run by someone in our church. We go and we support that. So we go and we cook for them. We take food. We play bingo with them. Usually one of us will share a little testimony, a story of what God's been doing, and we offer to pray for anyone who wants us to pray for them. And we've been doing that for the last couple of years, and we have a great relationship with Shepherd's House, and it's a great relationship with the vets. But that's an act of service. We love on them. We want to bless them. But actually, in terms of the missional imperative, the thing there is that we're taking some of our neighbors with us.
Yeah.
And actually, there are some of our neighbors who don't come to our missional community night, but they do come to the Shepherd's House.
Yeah.
And that's an opportunity. Those are the people we're really trying to reach. So we say, well, come with us and do the service project.
That's cool. That's awesome. Well, I mean, there's quite a few friends of mine who are pastors or church leaders and really wanting this multiplying disciples movement, missional discipleship movement and culture. Where would you start? I mean, what would you say to a pastor, a guy or gal who's trying to see a culture shift in their church and in their own life? Where would you tell them to start to kind of develop this kind of missional impulse in the church?
I think there's a few things. I think one is it's really important to be connecting with other pastors who are also trying to do the same thing. I think I think this is weird because we don't really think about it much in the church in the West, but there is actually a whole spiritual warfare dimension to this. The enemy works in a covert way in Western culture, I'd say, not an overt way. So it's easy to forget that he's there. But I've noticed that he doesn't seem to be that offended by people trying to grow large, big churches of Christians. But once you start trying to actually build a multiplying missional movement out of the local church, suddenly you start to hit spiritual warfare in a way that you've never seen before. And so I'd say one of the things is it's important to raise up a prayer movement, to pray about it. It's important to to make sure you've got relationships with other pastors that are trying to go on the same journey. You need to encourage each other. Very much as we've been doing, haven't we, Steve? And, you do that with other pastors. The next thing I'd say is that what you're doing is you're actually breaking some strongholds. Paul in 2 Corinthians 10 describes strongholds as ways of thinking that are designed, arguments and persuasions that are designed to stop us getting at the deeper things of God. And there are certain strongholds in our culture which really make it difficult. One of them is this, that the authority that pastors are seen to have to lead the church comes from intellectual capital, i.e. they know the Bible better than anybody else, rather than spiritual capital, i.e. they've actually done the things they're asking people to do. And so one of the things that we have to do if we want to begin to change the culture is we actually have to change change our own lives first. We actually have to build. If you think about Jesus, you'd think if anyone didn't have to build spiritual capital, it would be Jesus. But what did he do at the beginning of his ministry? He went and got baptized, even though John the Baptist thought he didn't need to. And then having been baptized, he went into the desert and he fought that battle of temptation with Satan. And it says in Luke 4, he went into the desert full of the Holy Spirit. It says in Luke 4, is it 14 or 15, he came out of the desert in the power of the Spirit. Well, why? What was the difference there? The difference was he nailed his submission to his Father and that he wasn't going to go after those other things. He built spiritual capital. And then once he built spiritual capital in himself, and he was manifesting that with the crowds, he was beginning to heal people and, speak truth. He went and spoke out Isaiah 61 in the synagogue, didn't he? All those things. As he did that polarized people. Some people didn't like that. Some people did like that. And of the ones that did like that, he then started to identify people who could go on the journey with him, and he began to recruit the 12 and the other disciples. And so I would say that we really have to put our own house in order as pastors. There's often a social contract that we have with our church that probably isn't written down. Well, in some churches it's written down, but it often isn't written down, but it still exists, which is this. The church would say to us, we will turn up on a Sunday, listen to your teaching, pay our tithes or a portion of a tithe, whatever. And, if we're really committed, volunteer to help with the programs. And in return, your job as our pastor is to feed us from God's word and look after us pastorally while we try to be good people in a bad world. Yeah. And that is the standard church in America today. And what we're trying to do is shift the culture from that kind of pastoral culture to a much more missional movement culture, which would be that the social contract would be something much more like the people would be saying to us, we want you to train us, resource us, and equip us as we give our lives to reach the last, the least, and the lost. And I would say that, you're from a Wesleyan background, Steve. That was the heart of the early Methodist movement. That was what Wesley was all about. That was the last big movement that massively transformed the UK. So for us, when we were learning this stuff, we were looking historically. Ironically, as we weren't Methodists or Wesleyans, we were Baptists and Anglicans. But it was Wesley that we looked back to as what was the last time there was a movement of people doing this in our country. And so what we found was that that's basically similar to the kind of stuff that they were doing. And we have to go first. So I would say, as a pastor, you have to start asking, am I spending enough time with the Lord? What's my devotional life like? Is it really rich? Am I giving the time to that? Do I give enough time to my family? Do we have predictable patterns in my family of devotions, for example? For me as a pastor and a husband and a father, from when our girls were small, we have breakfast together every morning, including reading the Bible and praying together. It's just part of what we do. Are we practicing hospitality? Are we having others in our home? I think one of the dangers, America is such an extroverted culture, and being a pastor is such an extroverted job, that a lot of pastors I know try to protect themselves from getting overextended by making their home a retreat that they go back to, and it's kind of sacrosanct. No one's allowed to, go to the pastor in their home. And I actually think that's a huge mistake, because it's not what Jesus did. Jesus built the discipleship movement out of the home. And so, our homes actually are places where we should be having people there. We should be building community. We should be building community, frankly, around food. We've got to eat anyway. And I think we need to make sure that there are other times in the day where we can recharge our introverted batteries. I'm not saying that we don't rest, and I'm not saying that we don't have time, solitary time on our own, time out. But I think that we've become a bit dysfunctional in how we've done that. And so I would say beginning to build some predictable patterns in the home of devotions. In fact, if you look at Acts 2:42-47, I think there's 5 things that you really need to do with others. I think it's prayer, Bible worship, devotional stuff. I think it's eating together. They broke bread in their homes. I think it's having fun with others. They enjoyed the fellowship of the believers, it says in that Acts 2 passage. They clearly were discipling others. The Lord added daily to their number, so people who don't know the Lord. And they also shared resources. Now, I'm not suggesting we all sell our houses and pool the money, but certainly there's something about sharing. For example, if you say, okay, let's identify one other key family in the church that we can be really good friends with, and we're going to do life with them together a little bit more. Even just the symbolic giving each other the house key, I think, is important, because it's what you do with your brothers and sisters. It's like we're actually going to behave like brothers and sisters, not like distant cousins that just get together at the family get together on a Sunday. So I think you have to start first in your own home and get your own house in order as a pastor, and then that starts to give you some spiritual authority to call the church to those things, rather than our authority just coming from intellectual authority because we know a lot about the Bible.
Yeah. So just to kind of summarize what you're saying, how I'm feeling challenged by this is, so often a pastor would say, I'm going to start this movement. I'm going to get all the intellectual capital. I'm going to figure it all out, come up with a great plan, do a new sermon series, give a book out for everyone. We're going to go through it as small groups, and here it's us on mission, so. And
let's learn even more about mission than we knew before.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to know even more and know even less on how to actually do it. That's been pretty much my first however many years. But so we've got all that, but saying, no, we're going to start that work in ourselves first. We want to be a disciple. We want to learn to live out of our everyday life, out of the overflow of our life with God, with our family, to be on mission together. And as we do that, we're saying, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I think one of the things that's been helpful for me, just to transition here, Paul, has been I had to come to a realization that I needed someone to imitate, because I hadn't seen it done in a way on how to disciple people so that I can disciple people who can disciple people. So that was a hard realization for me. And then being willing to admit I needed help. So I got connected to an organization called 3DM, which is all about seeking to, call churches together to equip them to do this stuff, to live life together, and to do that as a network. So it was incredibly helpful for me. And what the stuff you're sharing was helpful because someone like you take the time to invest in someone like me to watch what you're doing so I can imitate it. So then my kids and people in our church family can imitate it. Why don't you talk just real briefly about 3DM because you're involved in that,
Yeah. I mean, 3DM started because basically as we got all that breakthrough in that church in the UK, pastors started coming from all over the world and wanting to see it. And it was beginning to undermine the ministry a bit because we were spending so much time with pastors. We were like, we've got to have the time to do the actual mission God's called us to here. So in the end, when Mike Breen, the guy who was my mentor, when he left the church, finished his time leading the church there, he came to the States and started 3DM in the US. And then a few years later, we started 3DM in Europe, and 3DM now operates all over the world, really. And 3DM just stands for three-dimensional movements, and the three dimensions are up, in, and out. So it's really an articulation of the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. Up, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. In, love your neighbour as yourself. Out, go and make disciples of all people groups. So it's basically saying we're trying to help church. Most churches do 2 out of the 3 to some extent, and we're trying to help churches to live fully 3-dimensional lives that are really following Jesus. And what we do is we do lots of things. We do workshops and training and all those sorts of things. In fact, we have a lot of free webinars on the 3DM website, which is 3dmovements.com. And so 3dmovements.com. Probably at least a couple a month of free webinars. So if people are interested in checking out some more of the stuff, that would be an easy way to access some of that. And then for churches that want to go further, we actually do a full 2-year process of imitation, where we basically have a full residential kind of 3-day conference every 6 months. And then in between that, we do online coaching every week. And we go through a whole 2-year process of how do you actually transition your church into a culture of missional discipleship. And there's a few things that we have to learn. I mean, one of the big ones for me when we were first doing this was the models of discipleship I've been given were always one-on-one. And it was realizing that Jesus almost never did one-on-one. He did one-to-many. If there was one-on-one interactions, for example, the reinstatement of Peter, it was a breakout from a one-to-many group. And the reason for that, I think, is because it's all about multiplication. One-on-one is an addition model, So there's all sorts of things like that. So what does that mean? How do you do one-to-many discipleship? There's so many things that we learn along the journey. And then how do you practically implement this stuff? What about the people in the church who really aren't interested in that? What if that's the majority of your church? How do you do that? How do you do effectively a slow track and a fast track at the same time? So we really dig into those sorts of things over that 2-year process. And then at the end of that process, churches can just go off and use what they've learned if they like. Other churches decide to stay connected with some of the churches they went on the journey with. You go on the journey with at least 7 to 10 other churches, often from different streams, which is fun. And you get to know those different church teams and kind of interact with them. And some churches choose to stay connected with those teams long term, which is great. I mean, we've had probably, since we started 3DM, we've probably had about 1,000 churches now go through that 2-year process. Wow. So the other advantage that we've got now is we've begun to see patterns of what works and what doesn't, which helps us to help churches more.
What I think is really helpful is that this process is not a plug and play. It's not like you're going to learn, like you're telling us what to do. No. Because our church family, our staff team has kind of gone through this process. It's here's some tools, here's some mentoring, coaching, discipling. Here's some processes to help you figure out what God's calling you to do. But what I love is that the people who are teaching, the people who are coming alongside are people who have done it. And it's not just people who have read the most about it and can articulate it best. So it's people with real life breakthrough in their churches and in their own life with this stuff. So that's fantastic.
Yeah. I think in a way, 3DM are kind of, if I had to describe spiritually what we are, we're kind of like tool makers, really. I mean, our job has been to be a bit of an R&D department for the wider church. We had the advantage because we were based in Europe originally of being hitting these issues a bit ahead of the American church, and then develop tools that really help us to shift that culture and really to train people how to use those tools and become experts in using them. And so I guess that's kind of what we do. Yeah.
That's great. So if anyone's interested in that, I mean, they just go to the website and find out more?
Yeah, 3dmovements.com. They can go to that, or they can. They could definitely contact me. I mean, probably if it's folks that know you, Steve, it'd be good for them to just get in touch with you, and then you can put them in touch with us, couldn't you? So, I mean, my email is oh gosh, I have a long name, so it's a tricky one. It's P Maconochie at 3dmovements.org. That's P Maconochie is PMACONOCHIE.
That's good. You got your own name right.
Yes.
Most people slaughter my last name. It's so easy. DEUR. And yet in our own church, during child dedication, they put on the screen DUER. And I'm like, I helped start this church. And it's my last name. So talk about the greatness.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, Paul, thanks. I'll stop our recording here, but thanks so much for taking the time and sharing a bit of your story and being open to help out with folks. But Really.
Thank you. Hey, just before we finish, Stu, just one thing I'd say, knowing that part of who you're communicating with this video is with Wesleyans. One thing I would say is that what we're trying to do with 3DM, I would say, comes more out of what Wesley did than almost any other historic church figure. And a lot of the things we do, for example, we do a thing called huddles, which are very much like the class groups that he developed, based on the same kind of principles. And so it's been interesting that as we've looked at different historic models to try and understand how to do this alongside the biblical models, that's kind of where we've landed. And yet we've had very few Wesleyans, Methodists go on this journey with us. So I'd be really excited if folks did want to do that, because it feels like it should be a better fit for Wesleyans than it is for just about anybody else. So I don't know. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we found. So I love to share that with that. So that's awesome. Cool. Thanks, Paul, so much, man, for taking the time.
It's a pleasure.